Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's audio and web conference, How to Meet Compliance Requirements for Plain Language. Today's speaker is Deborah Bosley. Today's call is being recorded. If you would like to send your questions in to Deborah throughout the program via the web presentation, go to the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen, type your question in the text box, then click on the blue Send Message button. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you need CCBCEUs for this conference, please refer to the email you will receive from SCCE staff with detailed instruction. This email is sent out upon completion of the web conference. A copy of today's presentation is available in the conference material pod located on the left side of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Deborah S. Bosley, Ph.D., is principal in the Plain Language Group and professor of English at UNC Charlotte. A longtime believer that good writing is good business, she has spent the past 20 years helping corporations, government agencies, and nonprofits create written information that is easy for people to understand and use. In addition to plain language work for financial services companies, Dr. Bosley works with public companies to meet the SEC requirements for plain language in proxy statements, compensation discussion and analysis, management disclosure analysis, and 10-Ks. And without further ado, welcome, Deborah. When you're ready, please begin.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the SCCE and Liz Hergert in particular for inviting me to do this webinar today, and thank you all for joining me. I do want to preface my comments by saying that because of the nature of what I'm talking about, there will be a certain amount of reading of slides that you will have to do as we go through the webinar, and that's because when you talk about plain language, we're really talking about showing rather than telling. So I just wanted to kind of alert you to that. So let's go ahead and get started. The world of compliance, as you know, is a very complex one. Laws and regulations change so frequently, sometimes daily. Corporate practice, attorneys, all your clients, your customers, all make compliance and ethics a confused maze. And I'm going to help you today at least get you through one area of that confusion, which is simplifying the language that you use to meet requirements. Let me give you an example of what we are faced with internally in a compliance environment. So this example is an authorization hold for card transactions, which really means it means a savings account, a checking account rather, where money is deposited and then that money is on hold for credit card purchases. But notice the thickness of the paragraph, the text, with even if I did not have the kind of it's like my, oh my God, don't ever do this symbol. The text itself is very thick, very dense, and were I to run it through readability testing, I can't even imagine how high the readability would be. So this is the kind of information on an external basis that we often are asking customers to read. So I just wanted to begin with kind of an example to really say, don't do this. And if you keep that in mind, I think it'll give you a nice frame for the rest of today's talk. So here's our agenda. I'm going to go over what I think are the problems, and as I talk about compliance, I talk also about the response that readers and that customers sometimes have to disclosure information too. So I'll be talking both internally and externally relative to problems that are caused by overly complex language. Then a definition, what is plain language, some research on how we know it works, I'm actually a former professor, as was mentioned, so I have to give you at least a little bit of research, but I promise you that it will be easy and quick and not boring. Then we'll go over what are some of the strategies, because it's really important for you to see the difference between compliance material written the way it often is with how it would have been written had we been using plain language strategies. Fifth, I'll talk about the laws and regs that require plain language, many of which I'm sure you all work under or work through, or that confused maze of how do I get through what this requirement is. And then finally, how can your corporation benefit? There are many benefits to all corporations and nonprofits and universities for the use of plain language. So what are the problems? So internally and externally, these are just some of the difficulties that we all have as customers, as consumers, as citizens, as clients in dealing with the vast amount of information that is thrown at us on a daily basis. So even trying to figure out when you agree to your cell phone purchase, what exactly are you agreeing to? Insurance policies, credit card statements, etc. You can see here. There's a whole host of them. Employee benefits. So internally, when summary plan descriptions are written, how are they written in a manner in which the people using them how well are they following the ERISA requirements, etc. So we'll talk about that. Of course, behind a lot of the problems that you encounter in the compliance space is the complexity of the regulations themselves. And then finally, around complex language, we run into issues of liability, lack of public trust, and costly mistakes when people are unable to understand compliance material. As I always like to say, how can I comply if I don't understand? So let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about here. So a study that was done fairly soon after the whole mortgage crisis, and yet these numbers, frankly, have not really changed much. 63% of the respondents to this study thought that language around mortgage disclosures were intentionally made complex so that the average person would not understand it. 75% of people believe that part of the whole financial crisis is a problem of lack of understanding. And 84% of people distrust companies in general. Now, this was a while back. Today, that figure has dropped to 50%. But nevertheless, part of the distrust, frankly, internally and externally, comes as a result of our providing people with information that is too complicated for them to easily understand. So, as I mentioned, corporate trust is at an all-time low. Disclosures, this is what I think is a very important element, is that disclosure does not always equal communication. And I assume that's why you're here today, so that we can get rid of that does not and put an equal sign there. Compliance, as I mentioned, requires that people understand what they're complying to. Legal language, despite what your attorneys might tell you, legal language can also be plain language, or maybe I should reverse that. Plain language can be legal. And in many cases, for instance, contracts have been voided by judges who said there was no way that the signer of that contract could have possibly understood it. And, of course, right now there is, with Dodd-Frank and others, intense federal scrutiny around how information is presented to the public. Had I had the ability for animation, you would have seen this parking sign, which shows you that, is it compliant? Yes. Is it Does it disclose? Yes. But if you're sitting in your car with 10 seconds and you're trying to figure out whether or not you can park there, I think disclosure then becomes almost irrelevant. So moving on. Let me show you now a before and after to show you what I mean by simplifying overly, needlessly complex information. So what you have on the screen is a provision in a fee agreement, and really all it is an agreement between an attorney and his or her client about how that attorney will estimate fees. So let me just give you a few seconds. I don't really want to torture you and make you read it, but let me give you a couple of seconds just to kind of scan it. So that's as much as I would require or make you do. This is a one sentence, 110 words, and readability would say it would be read at about the 48th grade level, and I don't even know what that means. It's at least 3 PhDs. If you look at the example of the after version, now I'm going to ask you to read that. So now we have 26 words total, 2 sentences, written at the 12th grade level, and probably in many cases it would be even a little bit less because readability tends to be a function of counting syllables, but everyone knows what the word discovery means, for example, or what the word request would mean. But notice the difference between this and this. And yet, the after is just as legal and just as much of an agreement as the second, as the after version. So this is what I mean by plain language, the reduction of complex, superfluous words, getting to the heart of the matter very quickly, using common language and not using a lot of jargon. And as I continue, you will again see how this works itself out. So in the next slide, I want to point you to the fact that several years ago, the SEC dinged over 300 companies because their disclosures did not meet the federal requirements for the use of plain language. And what did they do about it? Well, many companies decided that in order to meet those requirements, they had to start using plain language in a way that made it easy for the reader to read and understand the information. So if you take a look at this, I definitely am not going to ask you to read, but this is a compensation discussion and analysis from a 10K, so for your SEC filings, to see whether or not this meets the requirements for plain language. And if we had more time, we would look more carefully at it, but basically what it does is start with a kind of mission statement, but you have to read all the way to the bottom before you get to any idea of what information they're going to cover in this CDNA. So if you look at a revision that we did, you'll see how much improved it is because of these plain language strategies. So now the new introduction starts by saying that senior executive compensation consisted of 3 key components. So instead of that information at the bottom, we now have it at the top. We have it numbered. It's in a list that makes it easy for people to see. We then continue. We also provide benefits, information about termination and severance, and perks. And finally, we do what is common in plain language. We tell the reader what the information is that he or she is going to read. So in the section below, we discuss the following: reasons, considerations, and amounts. So what we've done is taken a lot of information that looked like this and created something that is easier to read and easier to look at. For example, on a much broader basis, when the feds mandated that disclosure statements for mortgage statements had to be clear and easy to understand, they also included issues around the GLB around privacy statements. And so this is now a model for a privacy statement that is used, significantly used in the financial sector and should actually be used in others. So in this case, the reader immediately knows what the document is. That is, what do we do with your personal information? You'll notice we're moving to the why, what, and how, or as journalists would say, the 5 W's and the H. So why is this important? What is it that you're doing? And how does this privacy work? Notice then we go down into an easy-to-look-at chart that compares information on the left side with does this bank do it or not do it. So notice, too, how easy it is for the reader to move across from the information to see whether or not the bank shares your privacy information. And then finally, of course, we end with questions that they think that the reader would like to know. So a very easy look at a quick way to see how your privacy is being handled. So I've introduced you in general to some concepts of plain language, but let me give you a definition that I like to use, and that is that plain language is the use of proven, that is empirical evidence showing that it works, proven writing and designing strategies that make it easy for the intended audience to understand the information, to find the information, and then to use the information. In addition, conceptually, plain language has to be clear, has to be concise, and has to be credible. That is, when we talk about compliance, we're often talking about issues of transparency, and transparency and trust mean that the information is credible. So how do we know it works? So if you look at clarity, if you look at complexity, and you look at comprehension, so all of these bullets are based on research, that companies increase investment dollars when the information that they provide to shareholders are clear. Also, interesting studies show that corporations that use less jargon have higher corporate reputations. So the lack of jargon in and of itself will increase your reputation because it increases trust. Complexity. If a document is too complex, it decreases the ability to accurately forecast earnings, and it decreases the reader's estimation of the author's intelligence. That is, that bullet, I love this study, came from Stanford University, in which students were given a sample of writing that was easy to understand, difficult to understand, and very difficult to understand, but it was the same content. As the information became more difficult to understand, the students or the readers lost respect for the writer. In other words, they felt that the writer made it intentionally complex, needlessly complex. So think about in terms of branding, both personal, professional branding, and then branding of the organization. When information is too complex, people often blame now the company or the writer. And then finally, another study showed that by using plain language, the understanding of legal documents increased by up to 66%, which I think is significant in itself. I once had an attorney, I was doing something for the ABA, and I had an attorney say, well, if we wrote in a way that everybody could understand, no one would need attorneys. But luckily, he was a very young man, right out of law school, and some of the more seasoned attorneys, one of them raised his hand and said, look, everybody's always going to need attorneys. We don't necessarily, though, have to spend our time being translators, which I thought was a great answer. So, how does plain language make the complex world of compliance simpler? So that's where we're going to go now. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the strategies involved with plain language. I've mentioned a few of them, but I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper so that you can see how these strategies function within compliance materials. And then we'll get to the laws that currently require plain language, and I'll also give you examples of what the laws actually say. So what are the plain language strategies? This list has been gleaned from a plain language handbook that the SEC created for disclosure documents. It's available free on the SCC.gov website. It was written in 1998, really in a way kind of pre-heavy technology, and frankly it's due for an update. But nevertheless, those of us in the field of plain language do tend to, or at least I do, tend to use the SEC disclosure document as a set of standards for the strategies. So always writing for the intended audience. So when, let's say you're writing a code of ethics within whatever company that you're working for, that code of ethics is going to be read by a variety of people within the organization. And when you're talking about human behavior and what people can do and what people can't do and how they should behave and what you mean by ethics and integrity, etc., it's really critical that everyone understand that code of ethics. And if it's written from too much of a legalistic set of words or a legalistic point of view, it will be difficult for people to understand that code of ethics. So who the reader is very important in terms of how you write any kind of compliance information. You have to understand the purpose, use the active voice, etc. So you can scan down here and you will see you'll see elements that are appropriate for plain language. So I'm not going to show you examples of every one of these. We don't have enough time, but I am going to show you a few. But let me start by giving you a few quick tips. So here are 6 quick tips for plain language that you can use certainly in compliance material, but frankly in anything that you write. So research shows that sentences are best understood and remembered if they're no more than 15 to 18 words or 25-word maximum. And the reason for this is that particularly now in the age of excessive information, our brains cannot handle the amount of information we used to be able to handle. That is, our information processing. And there's short-term memory load becomes much more difficult. So short sentences are very helpful. The flip side of that, or the corollary to that, is therefore you want your paragraphs to be very short. Remember at the very beginning that one paragraph I showed you with the big red circle? No one wants to read a paragraph that looks like that. Even if they could understand it, it does not attract readers. So short paragraphs with white space to give our eyes places to rest. Also headings. Remember in the definition of plain language, it said that it's language that allows you to understand, but also to find information. Most people don't read from beginning to end. I doubt that anyone takes much of your compliance material to the beach to read in their leisure time. No, they skim it. They look for answers to questions that they might have or particular categories of information they're interested in. So headings allow people to navigate quickly. And we recommend, whether it's a screen or a page, that you have at least 3 to 5 headings per page. If you have information that's going to appear online, columns are easiest to read. It's very difficult in a computer for our eyes to go from one side to the other. And so the shorter the distance our eyes have to travel horizontally, the easier it is for us to read information. People always ask me, well, okay, what grade level should disclosure and compliance material be aimed at? And I always say about an 8th grade level. And if you use the plain language practices that I'm giving you, you will be able to achieve that. And if not 8th grade, at least something within the range of, say, 8th to 10th grade level. And again, it depends on your intended audience. If your intended audience understands jargon, if they are used to reading long, complex sentences, then by all means continue to write that way for them. But the vast majority of people really want to be able to read material quickly, get in and get out. And finally, design is as important as language, and I think you'll see as we go through the rest of today how the way information is formatted and the kind of visuals that you use to help readers comprehend information will become more critical. Now, the next slide gets to an issue that I'm sure several of you are out there thinking about at this point, and that is, doesn't this mean what we're doing is dumbing down? So to me, those are the 2 worst words in the English language. And to that I would say that no reader ever complained that compliance information was too easy to understand. I'm sure you've never gotten a phone call from someone saying, oh my God, this code of ethics was so simple, so easy for me to understand the differences in what I can and cannot do. Why did you make it this easy? So think of it this way. It's not dumbing down, it's opening up. That is, it's opening up information for understanding by the greatest number of people who have to read that information. Again, let me give you a couple of examples. So this is information about your right to get credit report information. Of course, as part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, we as customers have a right to the information that affects that credit report. And if you'll notice, so it is one paragraph, not particularly dense because it's written in a column, as I had mentioned to you earlier. Also, you'll notice that it does use the word you. You have a right. You also have a right, which is another plain language strategy, the use of pronouns to pull the reader into the information. So I would say if you look at it in general, it doesn't look like it's particularly difficult to read. But let's take a look at some of the issues that we have here. So we have, here are the rights that you're going to tell me about. Here's another right. Here's another right. Here's another right. So rather than jam them all into one paragraph, which means, frankly, that the reader has to do the work of pulling apart that paragraph in order to understand what all of his or her rights are, what if we were to have created it like this? So I mostly want you to focus at the bottom. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you have the right to. And now the majority of that thick paragraph becomes 3 easy sentences to read and to understand. You have the right to know the information, receive a copy, and dispute. Again, from this to this. So continuing, what do readers do? I think often when we write, we tend to make several mistakes that make it difficult for readers. The first thing we tend to do is we forget that people read that people decide in about 5 seconds or less whether or not they're going to bother to read it. And the first way they make that decision is based on how does it look. Second point, and I think this is something that very few of us actually understand or know, is that people read almost 30% slower online. So it's not enough to take a PDF and throw it up on a screen. All information that appears online, on a website, on a mobile, on an iPad, any online information, people will read 30% slower. Partly the reason is because of the glare that comes from the screen. So we all know you could lie on the couch and read a book for an hour and be perfectly content, but about every 20 minutes, if you're sitting in front of a computer screen, you have to get up and, at least move your eyes around a little bit. Readers also use documents as reference. That is, again, just using an example of a code of ethics, they're going to look for particular areas that are particularly relevant to them at a particular time because they read just in time and they use these compliance documents as references. People also interpret and create meaning, that is their experience, their knowledge, their education, their expectations, and their emotions are all involved in how they read and interpret information. And often that information has to be explained to others, which then supports the concept that the easier it is for them to understand the information, the easier it is then for them to both use it and explain it to others if necessary. So another area to think about in terms of what readers do is readers really want the questions to who, what, where, when, why, and how. So just as an example, I want to show you an addendum on a customer account agreement for a bank that we had revised, and we created these headings so that it was very easy, and part of it was a result of looking at the privacy statements that we showed you earlier. So who does this addendum affect? So when you're writing information for employees, who needs to read it? Not everyone always needs to read every bit of information. So as an example, when I was retiring from the university, I was trying to make some decisions about retirement benefits. I received a very long email from HR explaining about retirement relative to 401ks and the state plan, and it wasn't until the very bottom of the email that I realized that given the content, this material was not relevant for me. But I didn't even know it until I had read through the whole email. I was not happy, as you can imagine. So let people know right away who the information affects, that is, who really needs to read the information. What does the information cover? So what is the document that I'm supposed to read? What information will I find in the document? And then how does this information affect, and in this case, in this case it had to do with fees for accounts. And so it's a who, it's a what, and it's a how. There also may be reasons to add why. But it's a good way, both as a writer, to think about categorizing and grouping information, just as it is helpful to a reader to get information this way. So let me continue and show you a few more examples. Normally, these are before and afters, and normally I don't have an animation ability with this, so normally you wouldn't see the after until we had talked about the before, but in this case you're going to see them both at the same time. So one of the precepts of plain language is to use the active voice. And the active voice means you start with the subject and then you go to the verb, and then you go to the rest of the information. So subject, verb, predicate, or subject, verb, object, I think is how we were taught in school. So if you look at the before, we have this general industry and peer group data is gathered by the consultant and presented to the corporation in reports that provide an assessment and comparative analysis of executive officer compensation to this competitive market compensation. I'm exhausted. And you'll notice that it is identified who's doing what by the consultant. However, instead of burying who is responsible, if you look in the after, we begin with the subject, the consultant. What does the consultant do? She gathers the industry information and peer group data, and she then uses that data, and what does she do with it? Compiles, assesses, and compares. So it's the who does what. Next example. In this case, we're looking at information about about performance goals. Annual performance goals for our company are generally developed initially by ABC Company, an independent consulting firm with expertise in EVA-based incentive programs. The firm's recommended performance goals are reviewed by the committee. The committee approves the goals with any changes that they determine appropriate. So here we have the firm's recommended performance goals are reviewed by the committee. Why not say the committee reviews the firm's recommended performance goals? So if you look at the after, ABC Company, again up at the top, by ABC Company. So if we know who is doing it, why not put it at the beginning of the sentence? ABC Company, an independent consulting firm, blah, 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 developed performance goals. Our compensation committee will review and approve them. 25 words from 47, and we went from the 12th grade to the 11th grade, and as I said, the decrease was much less here because you're dealing with multisyllabic words, and no matter what the words are, they will always score higher. However, you can't count on that alone to analyze how easy it is for people to understand because, for instance, in the U.S., the word television would score at about college level because it's 4 syllables, and yet everyone knows what a television is, even, frankly, people who don't speak English generally. So two more examples, and then we'll move on. So the use of common words and phrases. Also, let me make a statement to say that putting information in all caps makes it very difficult for people to read that information. And frankly, I think most of us, when we see caps, we go, oh, that's probably important, but it's too much trouble and I'm not going to read it. Why is it difficult? It's difficult because English is a vertical language, and as you can see from the all caps, after a while it can become difficult to see the spaces between the words. The other thing is, in this case, this has to do with shareholder information. Notice the tone. No person has been authorized to give you any information contained or incorporated by reference in this joint proxy statement, and if given or made, such information or representation must not be relied upon as having been authorized. Again, I'm exhausted. The same information can easily be put in plain language by telling the reader what they need to do. That is, you should rely only on the information that in this document or that we've referred you to. We've not authorized anyone to provide you with different information. Same statement, same information, written in with half the number of, well, not quite half, 2/3 the number of words, and again, we're back down into the 12th grade level. So I mentioned earlier design and the importance of design for easy reading. So if you look at these two, obviously you can't read them, which frankly is part of the point. But on the left, we have a document written in the standard format that I've seen reports written in, whether it's health information or financial information or manufacturing. It looks like a report you would write if you were still in college. On the right, on the other hand, this is a CD&A or compensation discussion and analysis. On the right, the information has been put in columns. You'll notice that we have charts, we have bullets, we have more headings. And again, even though you can't read it, the visual appeal on the right side makes you feel the information is going to be easier to understand simply because of the way it was formatted. It also, of course, was rewritten, but even had it not been rewritten, just the reformatting alone would have made a difference. I mentioned earlier about the use of headings. So there are three ways that we can create headings. We can have a question, how do we benchmark pay? We can have a statement, compensation, that is a topic. Or if what we're doing is trying to move people toward action, we can have a heading that implies action, so benchmarking pay. So whatever kind of heading you use and whatever kind of compliance documents that you're writing, you want to be consistent throughout the document and think about, am I answering questions for people? And if so, let me use questions. Am I conveying just information? Then I can use a topic heading. Or the third one, if I want people to take action or to understand action, use a verb at the beginning of the heading to imply that. The use of positive language. So we only have a couple more of these, and then I'm going to get into the actual laws that you all have to follow relative to the use of plain language. So positive language. So what this basically means is giving people information about what they should do rather than what they should not do. Even when we're trying to modify behavior, behavior is modified and implemented best when people understand what they should do as opposed to focusing on what they shouldn't do. So here's a good example of it's a terrible sentence in and of itself, but it also in the before. So we have a lot of negative. If you prefer that we not disclose information, you may opt out. That is, you may direct us not to make these disclosures other than those permitted by law. And notice in the after, if you prefer that your non-public personal information remain private rather than not disclose, remain private, so that's focused on the reader. What the reader wants is privacy. You must opt out of our sharing that information. And then some disclosures can be legally shared even if you opt out. Again, we decrease the wordage and we decrease the grade level. We used, we use the word your. We focus on private, which is what's important to the reader, as opposed to not disclose, which is really, in a way, I think, more of a focus on the company itself. Wordiness, and I'll just take you through some of these pretty quickly. So wordiness is really a function of overwriting, but I also think wordiness is a much larger problem in that we are experts, and there's a tendency to want to tell people everything we know as opposed to what does the reader need to know. And we can accomplish that, again, by sounding human, by understanding that we're writing to other humans, and that we do not have to sound legalistic particularly in situations in which we're not really writing a legal document. So in this case, here, this notice, which had to be sent out, we wanted to inform people that there was a change in tax statutes and that there was an error that was made, that there is a change that's going to be made in withholding rates applied to IRA distributions. Okay, but if you read that, it just sounds like it comes from some bureaucracy. On the other hand, look at the after. If you took an IRA distribution, the North Carolina Department of Revenue requires that we increase your state income tax withholding rate by 4%. And actually, that should have been rewritten, and it should say to 4%. In any case, this change occurred. If you wish to send us different instructions, please fill out the enclosed form. Same information, written in a more human, much more easy to understand manner. So another way to avoid wordiness, obviously, at this moment, almost anything you write can be decreased by 30%. 30% just across the board. Use verbs, sound like a person, use short phrases. Real quick example, instead of make a determination of, we should determine. In other words, we should go from these awful nouns that we tend to use that create a lot of wordiness and that also don't focus on the action, which is really what's happening. We should we should determine, we will adjust, you should confirm, we agreed, we need to negotiate, etc. And just again, I'm going to just show you an example of how that played out. So here's a code of ethics for Netflix, and this is what their this is an example of what senior financial officers are responsible for, what they can and cannot do, what they need to do, what they have to do. And again, notice that we're looking at very thick paragraphs. Whereas when we use lists, we took the information and it looks like this. So to do so, senior officers will establish, confirm, and ensure. Senior officers will not knowingly make, fail, sign, respond, etc. So I'm not focused right now on the whole positive language thing, but really more on how much easier is it going to be for the reader to see what it is he or she should do as a senior financial officer and what they should not do, as opposed to making the reader do all the work and pull it out of this paragraph. And my last example is the use of visuals. So I'm not going to spend much time explaining this situation, but I am going to say that if you're writing information that contains numbers, you have to use a table. So if you tried to look at this has to do with a fee structure for a product for a bank, and the product actually no longer exists. But look at what happens when we put it in a table. So we go from the readers trying to line all of this up in their minds to a table that easily shows what fees would be. So now let me get to the existing laws and go through a few slides that have to do with those laws and ways in which this information is supposed to be conveyed in this plain language manner. So you'll notice a number of these laws, I'm sure, look familiar, if not all of them. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, TILA, RESPA, real estate information, credit card information, the Form ADV in which investment advisors have to disclose information about themselves, HIPAA privacy forms, GLB is financial privacy, ERISA, the Affordable Care Act. Now the Department of Labor has required that 401k fees have to be easy to find on your statement. I'm still looking. I'm still looking on my statement for where those fees are. And these laws are actually not simply something that the government is doing in order to make things easier, but also there are many attorneys who believe in the same area of plain language. So even Judge Scalia, obviously a very conservative judge, still believes that too many lawyers believe it's essential to legal English that one writes as pompously as possible using words and phrases that have long since disappeared. And another attorney who's also a professor, there are no serious obstacles to writing clearly and plainly if writers, and I think in this case he really means lawyers, have the will and the skills to do it. So let's take a look at how this works. When you're working with a federal regulation, the regulation will almost never tell you exactly what you have to say. They may give you a model, and many companies use the model language as kind of a safe harbor, but they do not tell you how to say. They just tell you what you need to disclose. So they use phrases like this to incorporate the following or equivalent language. Therefore, copying is not required, or to state a notice in substantially the following form, but not exactly, or the written notice must contain all of the following information, but it does not specify how that information should be explained. On a more specific basis, HIPAA, for example, says that a covered entity can satisfy the plain language requirement if it makes a reasonable effort to organize materials for the needs of readers. So, you look at this and you go, okay, so this is really intent as much as it is outcome. A reasonable effort, I'm not sure how you can measure that, but okay. GLB, financial privacy notices must be clear and conspicuous. So clear, I guess, means readable. Conspicuous means not hidden in the fine print. ERISA, your summary plan description, must be written in a manner calculated to be understood by the average plan participant. Again, in this case, they're really talking about intent, calculated to be understood, as opposed to actually telling you how you're supposed to write it. Or if we look at information around mortgage disclosures, so mortgage loan disclosures are supposed to use plain language for understanding, which means they succinctly explain the information in a clear format and design. However, recent research has shown that even with some modifications in loan disclosures, 90% of the people that were tested looking at mortgage disclosure forms couldn't tell what their upfront fees were. 80% didn't know or understand what an APR was, and 65% were unable to find penalties. So, again, I know this is a little difficult for you to read because of the size, but in this case, this is the redo of the loan estimate, TILA, that comes with your mortgage disclosure. And notice how clear and easy it would be to find information that you would be looking for. You have tables because you have numbers, you have headings, you have information at the top that introduces. You have here, it's very easy to see what your closing costs would be. It's easier to see what your principal and interest, etc. So the use, again, of plain language practices and principles has made it much easier for people to understand that information. Credit card statements. So the requirement for credit card statements is that they have to disclose in terms and language people can see, so I think that's the conspicuous part, and then understand, which is clear and conspicuous. There is a certain order. They have to give the account terms before or after opening an account. They have to show the consequences of decisions, etc. And what this resulted in is what we call the Schumer box. So the Schumer box is this bit of information right here, which makes it easy for the reader to see how much you owe, how much they owe, what their minimum payment would be, but I think more importantly in terms of the regulation, it tells you what happens if you pay the minimum amount and how long it will take you to pay back that loan. Because certainly information that many people simply did not know as they were using their credit cards. So I'm going to skip the next as just another way that one of the banks has chosen to display this kind of information. I'm going to jump ahead to the Form ADV Part 2. So the new requirements actually do say the words use plain language, or English rather, and really it should say language because much information is now also written in Spanish, and all other languages can employ the same principles regardless of the language. So you have to improve the format, expand content, ensure easy access, use plain language, and use narratives. That is, the investment advisor has to explain and describe his or her past investments, if they've been brought up on any charges, what their philosophy is, etc. And this is an actual part of the requirement that under the plain English bullet that you looked at a moment ago, so information should be concise and direct. It's not actually written in red. I just did this to make it easy. Short sentences, definitive everyday word, active voice, bulleted tables, avoid legal jargon, avoid double negatives. And I would say this is the most concrete example I've seen of a regulation in which they really do tell you what to do rather than just the information itself that would appear. And as you'll notice from what I've said today, each of these 6 elements are pieces of the plain language strategies. And this is just, again, in terms of design, this is a kind of a quick and easy way that an ADV Form Part 2 has been designed, again, with lots of headings, with short paragraphs, with listed or bulleted information. So I'm getting close to the end of my time, but I do want to explain how your corporation, your agency can benefit from using plain language. So the word transparent, everyone talks about transparent, but transparency doesn't just mean we're going to be honest about what we do. It means we're going to be honest and we're going to tell you about it in a manner that you can understand. It's only sunshine, it's only light if the people reading it can understand it. Otherwise, it may be transparent in your mind, but not for the intended audience. Plain language also restores public trust, and that means internal. That means the people who are working within your corporation as well as those you may be interacting with externally. Is that if information is too difficult for us to understand, it is only human nature to not trust it. And in fact, I could cite tons of articles and research that would suggest or prove really that poor communication decreases trust. Good communication increases trust, so clarity equals trust. It also makes the values of your corporation clear. Again, if you say transparent, then your language should be transparent and easy to understand. Plain language maintains corporate integrity. If you have a code of ethics and no one can, and people find it difficult to understand your code of ethics, what subconscious message are you really giving to the people about that code of ethics? Also, plain language in general actually does manage risk. I know attorneys tend to, and I do empathize with them because their job is to manage risk. but there have been a significant number of cases now in which corporations have lost because the information that they provided to their employees, whether it was employee benefit information or contractual information or even disclosures, where there have been lawsuits that have been won because there was no way that the reader actually could have understood that information. Plain language also increases the number of clients. As I said in an earlier piece of research, people tend to trust companies. They bring money into companies that provide them with information in plain language. I did some work for a large financial investment firm. They had sent a letter out to people nearing retirement. The letter started by talking about the IRS, which threw people into a panic. The intention of the letter was merely to say you're reaching retirement age and you must now take minimum distribution from your IRA, but the minute they saw the words IRS, they panicked. They called on the phone. I asked them how many phone calls they got the first week. They said they got 10,000 phone calls from clients who were confused and frightened by an IRS requirement. So quickly doing some math, you can see from that call-in center how the bottom line was affected, how much time was wasted, how frustrated, anxious, emotional the clients were about the response about that letter. When the letter was redesigned and sent out again, the positive calls rose to 98%, and this was not even part of what the company had expected at all. Many of the clients brought new money into the company because the information they received was so easy to understand and the experience they had on the call was very positive. So the bottom line on plain language is that plain language will improve your brand. It will improve your relationships with your employees. It will improve relationships you have with external clients or customers. It will make it easier for everyone to participate in the compliance life of the company itself. So I think at this point I'm very happy to take questions if there are questions from our listeners.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And ladies and gentlemen, to ask your question via the web presentation, please go to the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen. Type your question in the text box and click on the blue Send Message button. Deborah, our first question. How do you deal with legal counsel that insists the best way to write a policy or procedure is just to use the exact language of the statute, even if the statute does not really make sense to the layman?
Well, that's the biggest hurdle that we all have to face, and I have had a lot of fights with attorneys about that because that is what we call the safe harbor. And so I think what I tend to do is point out the fact that the regulation itself often does not require, or the statute does not require that language be used, as I said earlier. There is a movement in the federal government right now to create something called the Plain Regulation Act, which would require that the regulations themselves be written in plain language. So if that happens, I think the problem would be solved right there. I wish I had a magic bullet, well, I guess I don't want that, but a magic answer to that. But the way it's worked for me is to find an attorney, and there usually is at least one or two, who also understand the importance of plain language and can help be an advocate. The the tendency with attorneys that they tend to only want to listen to other attorneys. So I think finding an ally within a company can be very important. Also, if you want to contact me offline, I would be happy to send you some research information or some court information that I think will help you help them understand that lack of understanding is going to create a different kind of risk, but a risk nevertheless.
Thank you. Our next question. My current job entails working with our global headquarters in Germany. The German language is enamored of the passive voice, so I regularly edit their English translations, but they find it difficult to translate my plain English back into German due to the language preference for passive and oblique sentences. Any recommendations for working globally or with translators?
Yes, that's a really interesting example because in my experience, translators love plain language. The amount of money that, I don't have a slide in front of me, the amount of money a company saves by writing information in plain language to begin with is astronomical when it comes to translations. So, however, I also believe that it is important to respond to your intended audience. And so if the use of the passive voice is the primary way that Germans would expect and write, I guess I'd almost argue that perhaps that ought to be the way the ultimate translation is done, unless the company itself understands the importance of plain language. Plain language is an international movement. It's not just in the U.S., and Germany, frankly, has not been one of the countries that has bought into the concept of plain language, although Belgium certainly has, Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, France, Norway, Sweden, etc. So I think over time, I think you'll find the situation different. But for now, I would say that if the passive voice becomes the stumbling block, I would say work around it by using the other strategies that I've suggested here today, and perhaps that might not be one of the ones that you advocate for.
Thank you. Can you provide insight as to why the Dodd-Frank disclosures are plain language, but the rule itself is not? Because
regulations are written by attorneys. It's a huge problem. I always have to laugh at, I don't even know if it's irony or paradox or hypocrisy, but yes, in trying to read regulations themselves are extremely difficult. And if you get 3 attorneys in a room, you are likely to get 3 translations of regulations. It is simply a function of bureaucratic tradition and the dominance that the legal system has on how these regulations are written. There's a nonprofit in Washington, the Center for Plain Language. They were very responsible for getting Obama to sign the Plain Writing Act of 2010 that required federal agencies to write in plain language for when they're describing benefits and services. The next thing we're tackling now is to introduce a bill, I think as I mentioned earlier, called the Plain Writing Regulations Act, which would require that regulations be written in plain language. And frankly, we need the voice of citizens. We need the voice of people like you who have to deal with these regulations every day to make it clear to the powers that be that the regulations themselves are even with the best of intentions, are written in such an obtuse manner that it becomes very difficult for people to know with best intentions how to meet those regulations. So I've heard this a lot. I know Dodd-Frank has caused a lot of difficulties, not because they require plain language, but because of the way the regulations themselves have been written. So that, again, is not a problem I can solve other than to tell you that at every opportunity you have, you need to ask that question over and over and over again, because these regulations themselves are a big part of the problem that all of you are facing.
Thank you. Do you know if FDA and USDA are planning on rewriting regulations in plain language?
You know, I don't, but again, I am more than happy to look that up to find out if they are. And if you contact me offline, I'll be more than happy to send you any information I find.
Thank you. How can plain language be applied to contracts and service agreements? Maybe that's supposed to say contracts and service agreements.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there have been a number of lawsuits in which judges, and by the way, judges tend to be advocates for plain language because, after all, they have to sit there and read a lot of these briefs and summaries. And so there have been a lot of lawsuits in which contracts have been voided. But yes, contracts can be written in plain language, and again, I have examples that I'd be more than happy to share with you. I can write a will on a napkin, so there are a number of contracts that have been written in plain language that have stood up in court just as well as those that were written in legalese. By the way, I did want to mention, apropos of that, there was an article recently in Time magazine in which the privacy statements of companies like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Uber, and others were analyzed by a variety of people like myself. And if you want to take a look at a very well-written, easy-to-understand privacy policy, take a look at Google's. I didn't have a copy of it to put up on one of the slides. But yes, contracts certainly can be written in plain language. And again, I'm more than happy to share some examples of those if someone wants to contact me offline.
Thank you, Deborah. Our next question, are there any books you can recommend on this topic besides the SEC handbook?
Yes, there's, especially around legal issues, Brian Garner, Garner, has written a series of books on plain language and the law. But I think probably the easier approach would be to look at a book by Joseph Kimball, who I mentioned earlier, and his book is called Writing for Dollars. And in it, he lays out both arguments for plain language and gives you a variety of case studies in which the use of plain language has been extraordinarily successful. The Brian Garner book is called Legal Writing in Plain English. And either of those, I think, would be very helpful for those of you looking for a book. There's also a book called Plain Language Legal Writing by Cheryl Stevens. Let's see. Plain Language in, I already mentioned that. So I would say those would be the ones. Now, it sort of depends on the field you're in. So if you are in health literacy, the NIH, it's not a book, but the NIH has extraordinarily well-done guidelines on plain language that you can access on their website. So I would say it's not just finding books. I have a handbook that I'm working on right now that isn't quite available yet, but will be, that is going to lay out a lot of these principles that I've talked about today. But I think the three that I mentioned are a good place to get started, and they're relatively short too, which is always nice.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And there are no further questions, so back to you for your closing comments, please.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you all for spending your time with me today. I know some of the questions you asked are those that I can't particularly answer because they have more to do with the sort of deeply embedded issues that we have with legal language. But I hope that I've given you some arguments that you can use. I hope I've shown you ways in which your company can benefit. I hope you understand the importance of plain language. And I would say find allies, find others like yourself who believe in the importance of it. Find an attorney in particular who believes that plain language is critical to understanding. And again, if any of you would like to talk with me offline, I think my email address is on the first slide, and I'll be more than happy to, without cost, I'll be more than happy to give you some advice or point you in directions that could be of more help to you. So thank you again for joining us today, and go forth and use plain language. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Deborah. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the conclusion of How to Meet Compliance Requirements for Plain Language. Your speaker today was Deborah Bosley, and on behalf of SCCE, we'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and you may now disconnect.